Here we go. Well, my name is Alin. I am based at Aachen University, which is an engineering university, and therefore, as you can see in the picture, we've got ugly buildings and even worse photos of them. In this paper, I am trying to explore what would be an embodiment perspective on mediality. And why do I think that we need a mediality perspective on the body? Well, for an empirical observation, really, the fact that mediality is a phenomenon evoked by our body, by corporeality. And I think that such a notion has become more salient because of the recent progress of technological media. Because I think a lot of scholarship is converging on the idea that we need a construal of technological media as related to our embodied mediality. And I'm developing this theoretical notion as an answer or a contribution to the biosemiotic project of approaching culture, as Paul Cobley put it, in the interrogation of modeling. This, from a biosemiotic perspective, this implies cultural analysis that is not entirely subject to a language-bound and a type of analysis, such as construing culture as text or as form of texts. And another implied argument, I think, from seeing mediality as corporeal or as evoked by corporeality is that media, any type of media, establish spaces for assertion. I think media theory in general is useful for uprooting the long-lasting, enduring mind-body dualism that modern philosophy has entrenched in academia and culture, in Western culture broadly. From its very beginning, I think, in the 60s with Marshall McLuhan, media theory had some very good premises at overcoming modern dualism. Right? McLuhan defined medium as an extension of ourselves, and he talked about technological media, particularly as extensions of the body or of specific senses of our body, such as writing being an extension of our eyesight. Even a chair is in a sense a medium because it is an extension of our possibility to sit. But of course, McLuhan was developing his media theory way before the contemporary notion of embodiment and the theory that comes with it. So from a more recent perspective, Elstrom brings a critical addition to McLuhan. Elstrom notes that, in contrast to influential scholars such as McLuhan, who conceptualize media as the extension of man in general, I thus define media products as extensions of mind in the context of communication. And there might be the temptation to make out of Elstrom more of a Cartesian, because, well, if McLuhan says that media are extensions of ourselves or of the body, aren't we going back to Cartesianism by construing it as extensions of mind? Well, no, if, like Elstrom, we take on an embodied notion of the mind. And hand in hand with this notion of medium as extension of mind, Elstrom explains comes the idea that by media, we must, by medium or media, we must not refer only to technological media or mass media, and not only to premeditated media, but also casual media, and particularly media based on corporeality. And Elstrom develops this argument from a particularly semiotic Persian perspective. Why is it important to approach culture from a non-dualist perspective? Well, and the answer to that for me is rather clear. I chose to cite Petrelli and Brotier in this regard, but really there's so many that make the point. And I think that they are very explicit and also propose a semiotic take on the issue by noting that, I quote, the body is understood and experienced as an isolated biological entity as belonging to the individual. That is to say, as part of the individual's sphere of belonging. This is talking about modern Western culture. This has led, they continue, to the quasi-total extinction of cultural practices and worldviews that are based on intercorporeity, interdependency, exposition, and opening of the body. What we are left with are mummified residues studied by folklore analysts, archaeological remains preserved in ethnological museums and in national literatures. And I identify a medial cause for this extinction of cultural practices that involve corporeity. That has to do with print, or what Benedict Anderson called print capitalism. Dominance of print in Western societies and cultures inculcated a view of the mind as operating on materialist, disembodied ideas. Something which is suggested or inculcated through the print's supposed monomodality. And hence, I'm taking an embodied perspective of mediality. I'll say a few words about embodiment. Irene already explained embodiment very succinctly and excellently just earlier. I think a very good definition of embodiment comes from Varela and his colleagues, saying that embodiment supposes two things. First, that cognition depends upon the kinds of experience that come from having a body with various sensory motor capacities, and second, that these individual sensory motor capacities are themselves embedded in a more encompassing biological, psychological, and cultural context. I think that this is a very good definition of embodiment. Yet I do not follow Varela and his colleagues all the way, follow in the direction of their inactivist theory, because to explain the mind, they add to the idea of embodiment the idea of enactivism, that in that the environment is enacted by knowing subjects. And I think I resist that the anti-representationalist implications of that notion. And I rather I agree that embodiment is not yet enough for some reasons that we heard suggested in Irene's previous talk. And I think actually Irene Mittelsberg's notion of X-bodiment rather complements the notion of embodiment in a way that doesn't imply anti-representationalism like that of enactivism would. And the notion of embodiment stems from cognitive semantics, where it is linked to a schematic understanding of knowledge. Here, the notion of image schemata is very salient. Image schemata, for instance, Johnston defines as embodied patterns of meaningfully organized experience, such as structures of bodily movements and perceptual interactions. And it's such structures as image schemata that lie at the basis of our understanding of the world, of our creation of meaningful environments. And I find a parallel between such notions and the biosemiotic notion of Innenwelt, which of course comes from Jakob von Uexküll, but Sebeok has positioned in a proper biosemiotic framework, claiming that the Innenwelt, or inner world, of every animal comprises a model that is made up of an elementary array of several types of non-verbal signs. And in Elstrom's semiotic media theory, the notion of model is also instrumental. Elstrom takes what would be an implicit Peircean view on modeling. He defines a model, particularly he's talking about models of communication, says that a model of communication should be understood as a clearly outlined cognitive scheme that is both described with the aid of language and depicted as a diagram. So we see here in what would be an embodied approach to mediality, see that the modeling of reality, the modeling of subjective reality, of subjective environments relies on cognitive schemata, right, on diagrammatic, schematic meaning structures. And of course, this is obviously a notion inspired from Peirce, particularly in Elleström. And Elleström's definition of model is curiously similar, or has a curious similarity with notions with Peirce's method of existential graphs, which is a method of representing logical operations based on the principle of iconicity. That here the idea being that the representation of a logical operation must be similar with the logical operation itself, right? So Peirce defined his method of logical notations, existential graphs, as I quote, a system for representing logical notations, and I quote, to afford a method as simple as possible, which means with a small number of arbitrary conventions as possible, for representing propositions as iconically or diagrammatically and as analytically as possible. So we see here again diagram and language at once. So my point here is that modeling consists in cross-modal translations, particularly cross-modal translations of representations of assertions, analytical and diagrammatic. When I translate from an analytic an assertion from an analytic representation to a diagrammatic one, or vice versa, that is when I, so to say, when I construct a subjective world. And I shall note at this point that such assertions, according to Peirce, are performed on what he calls a themic sheet, or a sheet of assertion. There is a blank sheet of assertion, so to say, which we can define from a media perspective as the medium for existential graphs. So how do we approach the semiotic body or mind from a semiotic perspective? Well, naturally, I start from a semiotic perspective, from the beginning from the semiotic notion of environment, for which the German word Umwelt is commonly used as quoting Jakob von Uexküll. So Seborg took von Uexküll's notion of Umwelt in a semiotic manner, and explained that the best translation for Umwelt really in English would be model. Model renders this notion, Seborg said, incisively, that every subject is the constructor of its Umwelt, right? To construct environments is to model. And of course, the construction of an environment, according to von Uexküll, happens in actions of perception and action. The perception and action cycle is actually the definition of an Umwelt. But in biosemiotics, we have a notion of environment that has been developed through and through by a number of impressive scholars, but not that clearly a notion of the body as this specific Western modern concept, or this specifically this concept that in Western modernity has been constructed, has been contrasted to mind, right? And I think that was very well spotted quite some time ago, at least 15 years ago, by Friedrich Sternfeld, who announced that what is called for, and I entirely agree, the concept of the body, which in itself makes evident the basic semiotic competencies of an organism, that is a body concept which entails semiotics. It is to be expected naturally that this will give rise to a more fine-grained typology of bodies, depending on how complicated and sophisticated semiotic behavior the organism in question is able to indulge itself in. So see, I think that this will be known in a while from now as Sternfeld 1. This is Sternfeld before DC science. And of course, this Sternfeld 1 is not in contradiction with Sternfeld 2, unlike, say, for instance, Wittgenstein 1 and 2. My point here being that the development of Percy's theories of proposition by Sternfeld adds to our understanding of the semiotic body. And probably the other one biosemiotic scholar that explicitly talked about the body is Jesper Hofmeier, who located personhood in the organ of the skin, a rather bold move. Said that the skin, the organ of the skin, keeps the world away in a physical sense, but present in a psychological sense. It is the skin, he continued, that gives us the experience of belonging. It allows us to feel the world. That's a very important point because here I think Hofmeier uses the organ of skin to collapse an inner-outer dualism, right? That has been supposed by the mind-body dualism of modernity, and I argue also taken in a particularly linguistic manner by the signifier-signified distinction originating in Saussure. I think that this perspective here allows us to start bridging a very sharp dichotomy in the humanities, namely that between cultural and cognitive approaches. Very interestingly, one of the forefathers of social semiotics, the author of systemic functional linguistics, would have agreed on this matter with Sedok, that he says the ability he wrote, the ability to speak and understand arises and makes sense only because there are other such organisms around it. And it is natural to think of it as an inter-organism phenomenon to be studied from an inter-organism point of view. But it is also possible to investigate language from the standpoint of the internal makeup of that organism, right? So inter and intra-organism communication are semiotically the same phenomenon. I think it is this very interesting collapsing of possibility to collapse inner and outer distinctions in Halliday that have inspired later the development of the multimodality framework, right? The multimodality framework starts essentially with a criticism of the double articulation hypothesis in linguistics, right? Christian van Loven take fault with double articulations suggesting an idea of language as fixed, a la de Saussure, right? So they say that they are rather in favor, as they put it, of looking at a message as an articulation, as a form and as a meaning. Sorry, no, that's exactly what they criticize, and they instead advocate seeing multimodal texts as making meaning in multiple articulations. So what is the semiotic body? The semiotic, if we look at it from the perspective of the skin, as Hofmeier put it, well, it is an embodiment plus something else. It is embodiment plus, I here use Irene Mittelberg's notion, Embodiment. So to develop this notion, I then rely mainly on two concepts. Medium as extension of the mind from Ellerstrom, and its embodiment from Irene Mittelberg. Irene just explained better than I could do it a moment ago what she means by embodiment. I'll just quickly point it out. Particularly by studying gestures, Irene Mittelberg notices that explains that the body portrays, that is, embodies how the person conceptualizes and understands abstracta. And further, that embodiment then entails the motivated semiotic structure inherent to communicative gestures made with the hands and arms, as well as to expressive postures and full body movements. And In what has been called eco-semiotics, here I find very important insight. In an article from '98, when he established what he also coined as eco-semiotics, Winter notices not only the hermeneutic, but also the cognitive complementarity of Umwelt and Innenwelt. He says that Umwelt and inner world thus constitutes a hermeneutic circle, for the organism's inner world contains a cognitive model of its Umwelt, so that the organism is not just a recipient, but a constructor of its own environment. And I don't mean this is a very strict parallel, but I take it as nevertheless an insightful way of thinking of, on the one hand, semiotic modeling as responsible for Innenwelt and Umwelt, and cognition as embodying and exbodying. So the point is that we model. What does the modeling is? Well, the mind or the body, right? It is the same mind that has two directions. We are not looking an external subject, an internal subject, or an internal subject or an external object. We are looking at the two directions of the same mind that does embodying and exbodying. And the body is what mediates between Innenwelt and Umwelt. Herein occur those cross-modal translations between, for instance, diagrammatic and analytic that I mentioned a bit earlier. So, hence, when we say that organisms think, we don't mean that only that they think with their body, but they think within an environment, right? Our cognition is positioned, it is viewpointed, as also well Irene was explaining earlier. And within this cross-modal translation that the body does to construct a meaningful world happens primarily through iconic signs. I would say this is where we see at work the image schemata that I mentioned earlier. I find very insightful this criticism that Pero Brown had to the distinction between signifier and signified. Right? He noticed how semiotic theory or at least semiological theory has been construing inner and outer, signifier and signified, as separated through something like a world, something like a semiophenomenal world. And he reconstruct this through a metaphor. Well, the distinction between two is more like a window than a wall, right? So, quoting, the principle of semiophenomenal wall, Brown wrote, invites a strikingly accurate analogy, namely a building with an interior and an exterior. The windows show to people situated in the interior what is happening in the exterior part of the space. Windows show icons of the exterior to the observers located in the interior. Icons are windows, we could say metaphorically in the sense of Jacob's conceptual metaphor notion. And so therein, Hofmeyr notion of skin as the locus of personhood can offer such a view on the body that performs this iconic mediation, right? It is not a clear, it is not a obscuring boundary such as a wall, right? The skin both at the same time separates us from the world and opens the world to us. And herein lies this flow of meaning or translation between Umwelt and Innenwelt. And this then allows a perspective on technological media as stemming from the body. Right? I think that Gibson's notion of affordance is particularly insightful in this regard, particularly as it was updated recently from technology studies perspective and media perspective. Right? Gibson's main idea is that we do not perceive mere objects, we perceive affordances. Right? I understand what a chair is because I know what I can do with it. I understand I can sit on the chair, right? My body affords sitting on the chair. It's the affordance that I perceive, not the raw object, so to say, not the raw material object. And then recently, a notion of particularly technological media affordance was extrapolated from that. I'm not sure how to pronounce this author's name, forgive me. Maichak and others define media affordance as the mutuality of actor intentions and technology capabilities that provide the potential for a particular action. So it's simply a Gibsonian affordance taken from a technological perspective. And this is particularly salient because, as Hopkins, among others, recently noticed, digital media is producing a re-embodiment, a collapse of that mind-body dualism that print media, first of all, but also broadcasting, I would say, radio and TV, have inculcated for a long time, right? Hopkins writes that digital media is a uniquely human technology, perhaps the most human of all technologies that can be considered alongside other abstract human creations, such as language or art. So my point here is that digital media share affordances with human natural environments, much more than historically previous technological media. Because of course, from the notion of the body that I'm after here, obviously all technological media must relate in some way, must share some affordances with our embodied mediality. Otherwise, they would not be possible. But digital media particularly is multimodal and supposes collective participation on the spot. This is actually an expression of Marcel Danesi.
Sorry, I should have told you some minutes ago that you are out of time.
I'm out of time, thanks. I hope I'm not too much out of time. I think that I can end it on this point, that understanding the human body in terms of the mediation, the iconic mediation of the skin allows for a notion of technological media affordance that then is particularly good at highlighting the similarities between digital technological media in general, but particularly digital media and embodied mediality. Thank you.
If the audience is willing to give 5 more minutes, we could have 5-6 minutes for questions. Is that okay? And do you want to share the questions yourself?
Yes, I'm on the hunt for questions now.
Thank you, Alin, for a rich presentation. You mentioned a lot of different embodiment sources, and it just occurred to me that there might be some tension between some of them. I mean, you referred, for instance, to Cognition and Vitalis. I think there is some notion that modernity has almost eradicated embodiment. But if you really accept that diagnosis, how can we rely upon the embodiment as really elementally something meaning if we are eliminated from our bodies to the extent that they seem to imply?
Right. Well, I think that what I make of Ponce and Ventrelli's argument in that regard is that well, in actual fact, we can't really be alienated from our bodies, right? Print is not a disembodied medium, and it's not strictly monomodal. You know, the book object has a volume, has a shape, has a smell, but it's our effort to focus strictly on text as linear and monomodal, and in an ideological way, ideal as disembodied, that distracted us from the role of the body in meaning making, in knowledge acquisition. So I think that we're now just intellectually rediscovering how we've been dealing with our environment all along. I hope that I'm managing to answer. Thank you.
One thing, I have this impression that the semiotics, when it is studying this kind of phenomena like media and interaction and gestures, is always like after the things have happened, that we are doing an analysis of the current technologies or their knowledge. But do you think that based on this kind of theoretical frameworks, the semiotics can provide like some kind of hints or a guidance of how to develop new technologies and new forms of communication and to manipulate the data in digital environments and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, I think if I understand your question, I'll say yes. That's my answer.
How can semiotics become part of this guidance for perpetual developing new technologies?
Yeah,
I think that's the big break. Like we have things to say, but we don't know how to go. And
excellent point, really. I don't know how to answer the question how. I'm certainly trying to work my way into that direction. So if this came across, then I'm really happy. I think there's a long way. I think you know, de Souza, Clarice de Souza had this very convincing theory of semiotic engineering, and that's one way forward. I think you know, semiotics as a modeling theory is particularly useful for the digital humanities and for understanding the work of computers in general. I think that's very important. I think we need to understand that, you know, computing technology and mediality from a semiotic point of view. And yeah, there we, you know, I think that I'm really optimistic that semiotics has a chance here to pull the humanities out of a rather enduring crisis and from the delay in keeping up the pace with scientific and technological progress. How, I do not know, but I see the prospect. It's a matter of taking it step by step. I think it's a very important question. Thank you. Maybe I have time for one more question.
2 more minutes.
Okay, thank you, Erwin.
Thank you. It's just a quick comment. I ask if you can comment on. You're talking about technological development and embodiment. The technological development is not done by us, the programmers. It's only equal and subversive use. One quick example: the text message (SMS) that came in the 1990s were meant as an internal communication system for the technology itself, and it was quickly taken over as a communication mean by the users. And this is a common way of developing things. You see how all new media, also social media, are subversively used. Subversively used and be used for other purposes than intended. So when you're talking about technological development, you can't just look at developers and the engineers. You have to look at the whole use cycle. And this is where I think your embodiment concept of the digital is necessary, because this happens in the embodied use of technology, in our specific gestures on the mobile phone or on the computer.
Thank you very much, Erwin. I'm very happy to hear to know your opinion on this. Yeah, well, what can I say? Thanks for this remark. I also see that how, you know, in the example, to put in to the terms that I've been using, the example that you gave, it turned out that messaging had yet another affordance. Right? I think also the notion from racial anthropology of extrapolation that was keenly taken on in biosemiotics is very useful. Right? We developed hands the way in which we developed, or hands evolved the way they evolved, so we can grasp probably. But we quickly figured out that they're also very useful for pointing, and the pointing feature stayed as such an essential ingredient of the human species. Same for language, the capacity to speak verbally is a result of, is an accidentally result of an evolution, a certain evolution of the respiratory system, and we extrapolated that. So I guess that's.
And that's why we need to keep affordance disconnected, at least partly from intention.
I entirely agree. Thanks very much.
Yes, just one short question from Julio just when you were speaking. So the question was what you meant by mummified body.
By sorry?
Mummified body. That is folklorists see it. That's the way I understood.
Yeah, I think Petrilli and Poncio make an excellent point, and I'll just be brief and make a shortcut here. I think in that regard, Petrilli and Poncio certainly make an excellent point that at the same time, a print-dominated culture implied mind-body dichotomy and strict, fixed notions of, say, ethnic identity. And these two are interlinked because they come from this, they have the same medial for the mummification that we've done with museums. Thank you. Thanks.
And we'll do the rest.
Lina, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
It's not.
Hi.
Introduce her.
It's nice to see you, Lina. Thanks for being with us. Apologies for the delay. I'll stop sharing the screen so that you can start sharing the screen, and the floor is yours.
I'll do everything. Sorry. So next is Lina Navickaitė, and I will play a video for her. Her presentation is pre-recorded, but she will be with us to answer your questions. Just a second. So Lina Navickaitė, the performer's sound as expression, interaction, and meaning. Just a second. Here we go.
Good morning, everyone.
Just a second. Your screen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased that there have been other music-related papers in this conference, and my own talk offers reflections on expression and perception of sound in musical performance. Taking as a point of departure certain issues previously addressed in semiotics and music performance studies, I shall focus on how, in the art of music performance, sound becomes the primary sign of recognizability and means of conveying the original message of a given artist. According to Nicholas Cook, to study performance is to study people interacting through sound, end of quote. And that applies not only to the dynamics of collaboration among the co-performers in an ensemble or a larger group, but also to the communication that occurs between the performer and the listener. Such communication is constantly being affected by a variety of cultural, social, and individual factors. The artistic identity, interpretative choices, and mental as well as physical selfhood of a performer are determined by various circumstances, including natural qualities, personal background, the stylistic requirements of a musical work, and the constraints of a particular tradition. However, all this and more reaches the listener through sound. It is sound that becomes the vehicle for expressing, through the performer's body, whether as voice or using a musical instrument, the artist's individual interpretation, vision, and personality. Assuming that every performer possesses one or several characteristic features, we may say that some sort of semantic gesture dominates a performer's interpretations and distinguishes them from other performers. Here the focus shall be the sonic expression of this semantic gesture, that is, the expressive, emotional, and interpretative potential of an artist as conveyed through sound, and how this individual and apparently sonic sign reaches the listener through both acoustic and visual media. Visual, because, I quote Bishop and Goebel, the link between music and movement is particularly significant, since in most musical genres, movement is required to produce sound, and it is only by carrying out precise and controlled movements that performers can produce sounded music that fits with their intentions. End of quote. So, since both sound and the movement meant to produce that sound are such crucial means of musical communication, I see them as inextricably linked. Already on several occasions, I have worked on a semiotic model meant to illustrate the inner and outer influences, individuality, and standards underlying the creative work of a performer. The way it is seen in my work, the individual subjectivity, the moi of the performer's semiotic self, is intrinsically related to the Greimassian internal modalities will and can, while the collective, outward, the soi part of their identity is reflected by the external modalities as know and must. Thus encompassed are multiple spheres and categories through which the performer's art is communicated. That model has been elaborated from Eero Tarasti's semiotic square of a performer's subjectivity that you see on the screen now, and that's based on 4 logical cases related not only to the Greimassian semiotics, but also to the writings by Hegel and Fontanille. Tarasti's theory of a subject is developed in light of Hegelian logic, namely his categories of An-sich-Sein and Für-sich-Sein, as well as their expansion in Tarasti's work, being in myself and being for myself. I shall not elaborate here on how Tarasti himself interprets the given figure. The aim is to show an application of the performer's moi and soi as manifested in the sound production. In my own previous scheme, which is on the slide now, of the individuality and standards in the art of a performer, the Greimassian modality of will includes personal or family background, artistic tastes, or spiritual beliefs. It also encompasses the person's musicality together with the distinctive performer's charm or charisma. Can embraces the performer's technical capabilities, their psychophysical harmony. Also included here are virtuosity, corporeal reality, and a certain sound quality as realized in performance. No consist of pre-established social codes, the stereotypes of a given performance tradition or school. Usually, according to certain standards, some manners of playing are rated higher than others. And finally, must means the composer's intentions as put in the score, the work's imminent modalities. It is something called for by the requirements of a musical work, the subjective potentialities of its style. In this paper, the model under discussion is applied to the performer's production of sound as being the primary vehicle for attaining the sonic identity of an artist. According to my own observations and interviews with musicians, the following elements are among those particularly significant in the process of creating and producing one's individual sound. Will, in my view, denotes the artist's performance intentions towards the sound reality of the performed music. Of crucial importance here is the performer's body as a primary vehicle for sound production. This part of the subjectivity square also perceives sound as expression of the performer's individuality. Can goes further and means the artist's ability to foresee, hear, initiate, and produce an intended sound. While specific knowledge is needed in order to be able to master the instrument and manage the available acoustics, a great deal of, so to say, corporeal intuition and intrinsic abilities are involved in this process. Know is where the culturally learned features and interpretative decisions come to the front. With an extensive background of study and preparation for concert circumstances, a performer knows which tools to employ in order to create a certain emotion or a musical message through a particular sound quality. Finally, must is the area where such concepts as sound cantilena, tonal beauty, and other aspects of sound production appear as determined by the stylistic boundaries of certain repertoires and performance schools or paradigms. Naomi Cumming offers relevant thoughts on the matter, since her book, The Sonic Self, Musical Subjectivity and Signification, is primarily concerned with aspects of such subjectivity as they are experienced in music and by musicians. The primary work of the musician, according to Cumming, is to master the subjective potentialities of music itself on a given instrument, and to connect them with the requirements of a style combining the possibilities of a particular musical moment and the way it is composed with their own choices of sound, emphasis, and tempo. Something of the musician's own character will be heard in the choices they make, in the patterns of emphasis that constitute a performance style. This is the process that allows the appearance and the manifestation of their own subjectivity. Now, every musician has their own very particular approach and psychophysical relationship with the instrument and an intrinsically tactile sensation of sound. This idea holds true not only with string or wind players who have an opportunity to develop a particularly tight corporeal relationship with their own instruments, but also with pianists who are obliged to adapt to a new instrument on every concert occasion. Their most essential experience of the performance and the musical sound they produce is gained through this very physicality of the act of playing. Performers use their body movements to convey both information about the structural features of the music and the messages of their own expressive intentions. Rather predictably, then, the majority of studies dealing with sound in performance, especially more recent ones, tackle the physicality of the act of music performance and the intrinsic relationship between the performing body and the sound this body produces. Gesture becomes the key concept. I quote from Bishop and Goebel, "In the literature on human movement, the term gesture is used to describe the body movement that carries meaning. A movement does not have to produce a meaningful outcome, such as a sounded word or tone, to constitute a gesture, though sound-producing movements are gestures as well. Rather, it is the movement itself that is meaningful. The musical gestures used in performance include facial expressions, body sway, and head nods, as well as sound-producing movements like the drop of a hand onto piano keys or the sweep of a bow across violin strings." End quote. As you can see, this is not exactly Robert Hatton's usage, as we heard in yesterday's paper. However, as much as the gesture is not just a physical phenomenon, also the sound is not just an acoustic one. Naomi Cumming sees sound as something capable of carrying connotations, including those human subjective qualities stemming from voice, gestures, and actions, and that are of significance for our current purpose. In addition, her insights are importantly influenced by Charles Sanders Peirce's pragmatism and his interest in the play of signs, as well as by the whole area of feminist music theory. Thus, a significant part of Cumming's thinking on the performer's identity is devoted to the bodily signs of the performer. Similarly, according to Mark Lehman, quote, "It is through corporeal mediation that it is possible to engage in a behavioral resonance with music, so that personal subjective feelings, moods, flow experiences, and feelings of social bonding can be activated and exchanged." End of quote. In the last part of the paper, I will illustrate these reflections by trying to define the sonic individuality of a Polish pianist, Jan Krzysztof Broja. In addition to my own experience of Broja's concerts and the study of his existing recordings, I also used an open questionnaire for this research where the participants were requested to listen and comment on 3 parameters: the nature and quality of the sound, the pianist's touch and gesturality, and the style of the piece as conveyed in this performance. Non-professional responses were encouraged, and the questions were deliberately open, seeking for non-determined answers, hypothetically featuring a variety of adjectives used to describe the pianist's sound and touch. The final sample of the respondents consisted of 40 volunteers. 11 of them were professional pianists, 12 other musicians, 8 musicologists, and 9 non-expert listeners, some of them having a primary music education background. Now let us watch an excerpt of Jan Krzysztof Broja playing Scarlatti's Sonata in F minor.
Excuse me, I'll shortly interrupt presentation to play the performance in a separate video because it's better quality. Just a second. There we go. Now we'll continue. Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the concert on Thursday. Bro, I was playing.
Yeah, and it has very controversial reactions already, as always, with Broya's concerts.
Just a second. I will reshare. Yes.
According to one of the respondents who perceived the sound of the sonata as sacred because it would not suffice to calling it soft or anything of the like, sound became the center of the whole performance. While such sound intensity and a kind of slow motion effect may become a defining factor for hypnotizing the audience in concerts, the choice of an unusual tempo and the abundance of rubato as heard from the recording made some of the respondents perceive it as stretched, squashy, and heavyweight interpretation, while for others this sounded as an intellectualist discourse with the utmost time control and, quote, maintaining a unified pulse as a golden thread throughout the piece. Since playing slowly requires a rather different treatment of articulation and dynamics, no wonder that the movements of the pianist become a dance at the piano. Such a slow tempo allows focusing on highly expressive yet controlled gestural shaping that, in Broya's performance, follows the minutest detail of the music and, again, receives contrasting feedback from the listener's part. It seems that the pianist's gesture not only prepares, depresses, and releases a note, but it is as if the continuum of the performer listening to that note lasting is also accompanied by an additional hand or elbow movement. The question concerning the relation between the pianist's gestures and sound production was not accidental, and it is telling how the majority of the sample's pianists went into detail about the peculiar bodily postures and movements that Broya employs in order to achieve a certain sound quality. The specific elbow movements of the pianist were emphasized more than once by the respondents, both as a means for attaining a particular type of touch and for sustaining a listening to the sound before it vanishes. It has also been noted that the pianist's posture during the performance is rather curvy and bending towards the piano. A swinging quality in his movements makes the performer approach the keyboard during the softer pianissimo passages almost as if he wanted to hear better or wanted to create more intimacy with the instrument. This intimacy and a delicate dialogue with the piano has been observed by the majority of the respondents, their comments noting Broya's talking to the instrument, intimate talking, a focused, very close physical contact with the instrument, and a subtle, sensitive intercourse with the other. Two respondents said Broya's hand gestures were mesmerizing, which, besides most likely being a way to say that looking at them was pleasant or involving, may refer to the fact of the pianist employing a vast arsenal of hand, arm, and torso movements, which permeate his whole performance, as is mentioned above, hypnotize the audience. It must be said that the multitude of gestures may equally be both a disturbing and enriching experience when encountering a live performance, depending on the unity and integrity between those gestures and the oral experience. Here, the conclusion can be drawn from several remarks noting that the totality of the pianist's movements was illustrative, precise, well coordinated, used to make musical points, and clearly reflecting the concrete goals of the performance, such as intonation, phrasing, and general microscopic speech-based playing. One respondent commented that the physical contact of the performer with the instrument and the clarity of his gestures was so obvious that the musical flow could be perceived even without hearing it. What may be leaning towards the individual sound of this particular artist as perceived by the listeners is his tendency towards a specific, very precise, a surgeon's precision, well-articulated and controlled piano touch, defined by the respondents in the extremes of sharp versus soft, very hard versus plastic, aggressive versus tender, and strong versus sensitive, which produces very live, varied and expressive, crystal and bright sound, the one with the extreme colors dominating, sometimes unpleasantly contrasting, and spontaneous and unusual with a certain jazz flavor. Depending on the character of the moment that the pianist aims at conveying, the sound quality was described as ranging from an impossible subtleness and tenderness to heavy but not rough, and thought of as aiming towards the impossibility of dynamics and touch. It has also been noticed that even though in this particular sonata the pianist's dominating sound is intimate and long-lasting, his touch can also be heard as sharp in other works or a few particular moments of the sonata, which suggest not the inability of the pianist to control the sound, but rather his choice of shaping the sound in a variety of ways, depending on the interpretive choices. To summarize and to bring this paper back to the Gramscian modalities and the square of the subjective sound production in performance, Breuer's will likely features corporeality brought to an extreme as the primary carrier of the music's meanings. Physical features of the acoustic signal are very clearly articulated, and the bright, brilliant, crystal-clear sound quality may dominate over the performer's other interpretative choices. Talking about the modality of can, the technical nuances of the given recording must be mentioned, since the piano seems to be particularly comfortable and the microphones properly situated. However, the feedback of other pianists having played that very piano allows making an assumption that it is primarily the pianist's professionalism that lets him produce such a variety of colors when playing the instrument that was rather new at the time. By the way, we are talking about the Klaipėda Concert Hall in Lithuania. Some sort of anticipatory imagery when it comes to intended sonorities at the communicated meaning should be noted. As mentioned above, the pianist pays particular, rather microscopic attention to preparing, producing, and fully hearing every motive. No, in my scheme of the performer's sonic identity presupposes some sort of rationality based on the individual corporeal reality. As mentioned before, Breuer has a very interesting, almost dancing touch for the piano. And it has been noticed by many a respondent that this specific gesturality and choreography demonstrates that pianist's clear knowledge of the chosen means to achieve the wanted sonority and convey the intended meanings. And finally, the must in Breuer's case manifests itself in a rather original way the pianist decides to interpret, or rather reinterpret, the pianistic canon. Certain features of the musical work dominate over the others, perhaps only intuitively approaching the historical truth and rather seeking to convey the emotional message of the piece. The pianist himself offers a very interesting concept of emotional architecture as his strategy when preparing a musical work. He defines it in a number of ways. I quote the score itself in my limited and biased version, the information from general analysis useful for a performer, the communicative potential for general or specific audiences, something like a script for a stage drama, and last but most importantly, and usually the starting point, a map of what I personally feel in a piece and want to communicate to the listeners. End of quote. To conclude, one of the crucial elements of the pianist's communication is his choreography of sound-producing gestures, to borrow Godoy's term, which is of utmost importance on how we perceive music and what do we refer to later as Breuer's sound, as something that makes his interpretations distinct. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the interesting presentation, Lina. It's good to hear you and to see you, though I'm sorry you're not here with us, of course. We've got 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, I can see already the online question. Maybe
Right.
I can. maybe I can read it myself simply.
Yes, please go ahead.
It's by Ina Merkulova. Thank you. Thank you for the interesting conference, Lina. My question is, have you done any research on the artist's choice of instruments? For example, is it known that Richter only played Steinway, and this also influenced the quality of the tone and his style? Thank you. This is an amazing question, particularly since we're now talking right after the famous Chopin competition has finished in Warsaw, which is one of the hugest events in the piano world. And there, the pianists were using very different, I think, 3 pianos, which were Steinway, Fazioli, and Kawai. And one can notice how many comments were related by the spectators of the competition online, how many comments were related to the choice of the instrument, because some of them would help the participants, the competitors. Some of them would actually do the wrong thing, because for instance, measuring the acoustics for the grand hall, you need a piano that is probably as sparkling as a Steinway, and sometimes the pianist would choose a softer, like Fazioli sound, which sounds wonderful in, let's say, the authentic Chopin salon, but perhaps less brilliant in the grand hall, which is very important. And yes, there are artists who specifically choose certain pianos and they just stick to them for good. Well, they find their own sound that suits the instrument. I see 2 more online questions. I don't know, Alin, should I just continue with those?
I would say so, yes, please.
Okay, so Claudio Rodriguez Higuera, sorry. Could bodily movements in a performance be codified as musical elements themselves in a strict way? Perhaps one of the controversies raised by such performances is the lack of conventionality in this case. Do you think there may be a more ritualistic approach to movement in a way that it would be considered a musical aspect as following a certain canon? Wow, that's very interesting. I actually think that there is a lot of rituality in a classical music performance, perhaps even too much. And people like Jan Krzysztof Broje, whom I showed now, I think he's breaking those canons in a way, and his physicality and his corporeal messages are too far from the canon, from the ritual. And that's why they're often calling for very controversial reactions. Like, there are too many movements, first of all. That's how it's perceived by the strict listeners. Then they're also, even in a sense that he's breaking the codified rules of how you have to look on stage. There is some sort of misbehavior. So I think he's very much breaking the conventionality. So I don't know if I answered your question. Whether it can be codified in a score, I'm afraid not. Also in contemporary music, there are attempts also to do that.
We've got two more minutes and 2 more questions. So Lina, I think
okay,
it's up
so
to
there
you.
is another online question, Julian Hellaby. Fascinating talk, thank you. In the must area of the semiotic square, you mentioned tonal beauty. Are there other types of tone quality that could be included? For example, aggressive for Bartók's Allegro Barbaro. Yes, thank you, Julian. Of course, the tone must be chosen appropriately to every musical piece, of course. However, I would say that particularly this tonal beauty is something that has been preoccupying the musicians since the dawn of times, and the cantilena, especially with the piano, with which it is more difficult to produce the sound of the voice. I would say that probably the attempt with every other instrument is to imitate the human voice. And with piano, it's most difficult to do that. And I guess that's why it's such a great issue. So the tonal beauty and the singing tone is perhaps the thing that that worries musicians most. And I have another online question.
Sorry, if I may interfere, we're almost out of time, but I noticed that earlier online, Juan Felipe raised a hand. I would suggest maybe hearing Juan Felipe's question quickly, if Juan Felipe would like, and maybe Lina can try a quick answer. And then I know it is frustrating. I think we'll leave questions for discussions in private.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Yes, it was very interesting. I was wondering whether maybe instead of framing this process of performance in terms of communication, what could frame it in terms of interaction? It might be very similar, but I think that in terms of interaction, perhaps one could also modulate the affective aspect, right? Because communication is mediated, but affect is sort of immediate. And I wonder, what do you think about that? Like, how do you make room for affect as such within a communicative schema?
Thank you. It's a great remark. In fact, musicians use their messages and their gestures as a way to affect the listeners, and sometimes they embellish certain movements that would not be necessary strictly for playing, like in lexical sign, just something like composed gestures that are in the score. But in order to provoke a certain reaction and to emphasize their emotional state, or in order to arouse that emotional state in the listener, they tend to do certain more curves with hands and facial expressions that are meant to exactly provoke certain reactions from the listener's side. So yes, it is very, very important aspect of that.
Well, on this note, thanks very much, Lina, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.
We will now move on to the final speaker of this session before a coffee break. That is Claudio Rodriguez. Claudio, you're with us? Yes, you are.
Yes, I am.
It's good to see you, by the way.
Thank you.
The floor is yours. I believe that you can share screen.
I think I can, yes.
Yes.
All right. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Great, great. That's very good. Thank you, thank you. Hi, everyone. I wish I could be there in Lithuania with you all, but sadly, things don't turn out the way we want them to sometimes. My presentation today is going to be semiotic disembodiment. Now, I guess I can introduce myself a bit. Some of you already know me, so for those of you who already know me, hi. For those of you who don't know me, I did my PhD in semiotics in Estonia, and I work mostly with metaphysics of biosemiotics and the theory of how we build semiotic theories. So generally, that's where I'm coming from. Now, I have good news and bad news as for this presentation. The good news is that, and this is mostly for the organizers, this is a very humble and short presentation, so perhaps we'll manage to get back on track in terms of timing. The bad news is that it's a very humble presentation, and this is for the audience. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to follow up the quality of the presentations from before, especially Alin and Lina's presentations, both of them, which were very, very interesting. But at least I think that I can be on topic in terms of a couple of things, particularly regarding what Alin was talking about. As you see, the title of the presentation is Semiotic Disembodiment. And though my initial idea was trying to flare up a bit of controversy, at the end of the day, it ended up being mostly just a couple of technical concerns regarding semiotic concepts. So I'm afraid it's much humbler than I expected it to be. And you may see also that I've chosen a very weird graphic for the presentation, which is Superman Red and Superman Blue. Now, I don't know how many of you grew up reading comic books, but Superman in the 90s at some point became two. You may know that Superman died and then he came back to life, and then at some point they divided him into different forms, red and blue. Then this nonsense stopped, but I want to use this as a bit of a metaphor about how our semiotic concepts and our semiotic theories may not always share the same body that we think it may want to share. So in this presentation, we're going to deal with how many concepts may be part of an embodied theory, but they themselves may not be particularly embodied, or perhaps we may not have thought of them fully as embodied concepts. The core of the presentation is going on about what is semiotic about embodiment and what is embodied about semiotics, and whether semiotic concepts can be embodied by themselves, and if that works at all. How do we make those things work? Again, as I said, this is a very humble presentation, so I don't think I will have actual answers more than just questions and jumbled and rambling thoughts about problems with concepts. So I hope that you're not all too disappointed as I myself would be watching this presentation. In any case, we've already seen a bunch of presentations that deal very thoroughly with embodiment in semiotics and how semiotic concepts play out with a lot of with embodied theory. So I want to talk first about what is semiotic about embodiment. And again, in order to make this presentation less dry and a bit more entertaining and informative, I want to keep the graphical aspect a bit higher. You may see here Swamp Thing, who as a comic book character is very much in tune with the earth. He can speak to the earth, he can speak to its environment. Now, usually when we talk about embodiment in semiotics, we follow a very specific line of thought. We have the interaction between organism and environment as one of our main tenets. We have the usage of signs not as representations, but as general signs, right? And we talk about the subjectivity of the world of the organism. If we talk about each of these one by one, we will more or less agree on a number of theoretical possibilities that are already present in semiotics. And I am approaching this particularly with a bisemiotic orientation. So perhaps if you are more interested in the semiotics of aesthetics or art of performance, this may not be as informative for you or as interesting, but I hope perhaps that we all share more or less a common set of background assumptions about how we deal with embodiment in semiotics, right? When we talk, or at least when I talk about interaction between organism and environment, it seems to be a fairly semiotic phenomenon in that we want to address the subjectivity of the organism as related to its possibilities to actually relate, I guess, to their environment. We talk about signs not as representations, of course, following Pearson theory for the most part, though not necessarily limited to it. And this seems to be fairly important because when we're talking about embodied cognition in general, we are dealing with a theory against representation, right? So usually we have to remember that embodied cognition is by itself, at least lato sensu, a rejection theory and replacement of theory of mental representations. And so if we want to play out how the rejection of representations works with semiotic theory, we have at our disposal at least the tool of abstract signs or general signs. And finally, though related to the first point, the subjectivity of the world of the organism becomes fairly important in how we want to express that the role of the organism with regards to the environment may very well be one of not connection because of the representation, but rather connection because the organism is embedded in the environment. We all may also remember that generally when we talk about embodied cognition, we talk about the 4 big E's, right? So with this in mind, I feel like it's important that as we develop our semiotic theories that are embodied, we need to be mindful of how different theories of embodied cognition may play out. At the end of the day, of course, there's a caveat in that we may actually not necessarily want to do embodied cognition when we're talking about an embodied semiotics, right? We may want to do simply a sense of embodied semiotics without dealing much more with cognition as a processing of concepts or a processing of behavior. But in general, at least it seems that a large part of the concern is in making semiotics work within an embodied framework. And in this sense, when I'm not going to expose all of this because I'm pretty sure from what I've seen, most people are already fairly aware of this. There's a number of theoretical sources for embodiment that are already very present in let's call it cognitive semiotics. We start with ecological psychology in the Gibsonian sense. When we talk about affordances, we talk about the critique of the poverty of the stimulus, and we talk about active perception, right? This specific source seems to have informed a large number of embodied semiotic theories to the degree that we talk about affordances fairly often, even in contexts that may not have anything to do with perception. And let's remember that usually theories of embodied cognition are theories about mental functions as we start with the role of perception. If we are adamant that our sources of knowledge about what the mind does do not have to be conceptual or having any sort of representational or computational mode, then we will most likely move towards an ecologically grounded theory of perception. And it's interesting to think that Gibson himself was fairly influenced by Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. With phenomenology, we have a form of non-reductive experience. We talk about subjectivity, we talk about a bodily epistemology that has already a very important role, it would seem, in dealing with how we have access to our environments and how we are perceptually active, because we're capable of doing at least some form of analysis of the experience of the organism. And it's also interesting to think that one of the sources for Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology can be found in one of the mainsprings of biosemiotic theory, which is theoretical biology in the words of Jakob von Uexküll, right? We talk about the Umwelt and we talk about the functional circle. I'm not going to try to pronounce it in German because I'm going to butcher it. But when we deal with these particular concepts, we see how everything is put together. There's a bit of an arrow of influence towards embodiment. And modern theories of embodied cognition will still have an important core of concepts that comes from that. Even if we go into conceptual metaphor theory or things like that, we will still have at least some shared ground with ecological psychology. So with that said, we need to perhaps, since we already have this source material and we have at least a bit of an agreement about the things that semiotics can do with embodied cognition, we can ask ourselves, what is embodied about semiotics? There are, of course, a fairly large number of cases that have been made about semiotic theories being embodied. So one thing that I think is worth asking is whether any embodied semiotic solves any particular problem that other forms of embodied cognition in terms of theory are incapable of that would mean being addressed, and that perhaps would be more useful seeing it in an embodied semiotic sort of perspective. I believe that we can ask at least a number of questions about what exactly is embodied about semiotics. I tried to come up with 3 questions that would address the general question of what exactly is embodied in our theories of semiotics. The first question would be, what part of the semiotic terminology implies embodiment? Another question, the second question would be, what part of theoretical ontology is a bodily event? And finally, what concepts of the semiotic theory are necessarily embodied? So let's just imagine we're only taking Uexküll's functional cycle or circle into our semiotic theory. Let's imagine that our embodied semiotic theory is only using the functional cycle as its theoretical background and its theoretical workhorse. We would try to ask whether the semiotic terminology, the functional circle itself is implying any sort of embodiment. And it would seem to be that since we're putting both the perceptual side and the effector side together, there is a sense of embodiment in that the effector side will actually imply a physical correlation to cognition. As we keep progressing with these questions, we will have maybe a more developed sense of that the functional circle itself is going to be necessarily an embodied part about our semiotic theory. So in a way, what semiotics is trying to do in a sense of embodiment is kick a bit out the brain of the equation in order to talk about the general aspects that we semioticians or people concerned with semiotics may want to do. So we're kicking that brainiac out. We are trying to put the body as the general norm. And in that sense, embodied semiotic theories are pretty much in line with embodied cognition, at least in a more, let's say, ideological way. So let's maybe ask another important question about whether semiotic concepts themselves can be embodied. There are concepts that are, as we've seen, fairly useful and that lend themselves to being embodied, such as Uexküll's concepts of the Umwelt and the functional circle. Uexküll's philosophy of perception, as it is so influential for embodied cognition, is indeed a very good candidate for such embodied sense of embodiment. But when we start dealing with other semiotic elements, perhaps we are going to struggle a little bit with what the objects of our theory want to do. So for instance, let's talk about pairs having the concept of the sign and what we want to do with a Peircean sign in terms of a general embodied semiotic theory. So it's important to remember too that in embodied cognition, a large component of the 4E is behavioral in nature. And an embodied semiotics may want to ask, especially if you are in the Peircean variety, whether that is permissible or desirable, on account of the fact that behavioral accounts of Peircean theory have always been met with certain resistance. In this sense, we may not be capable of saying whether Peirce himself would have liked having a behavioral account. And we've seen how, for instance, Morris's account of Peirce was in fact rejected to a certain degree. So perhaps there is an important question that I think is worth asking right now, and it's a fairly quick question to ask. Are signs embodied or embodiable? So there are a number of issues and situations that may arise from us trying to think about whether signs are themselves embodied. What do we consider an embodied sign? Let's remember, for instance, there's this common quote of Peirce about giving orders and having an interpretant, an energetic interpretant of the soldiers. I don't remember the exact quote, but you probably all remember about a drill sergeant giving orders and musket man just jumping on command or something. And this seems to be a fairly good case of at least one part of the sign, which is the interpretant, being fairly embodied or embodiable at least. But what happens when we're dealing with interpretants that do not lend themselves to such a specific form, such as conceptual interpretants or logical interpretants in the person parlance? I wonder if those are salvageable in an embodied semiotics. In embodied cognition, there's usually talk about situation semantics in order to rescue language from the claws of representationalism. And yet this is still a big problem that keeps arising. So what kinds of signs can be embodied and what kinds of signs cannot be? We have to ask ourselves whether our semiotic theories are capable actually of being fully embodied, or if our semiotic theories are themselves being part of a potentially representational aspect. What I call semiotic disembodiment, or the disembodiment of semiotic concepts, is the fact that some concepts within semiotic theories may hint at embodiment, yet they are not embodied concepts and may not even be compatible with a fully embodied account of cognition that sometimes, and perhaps even more often than one would want, disembodied concepts play a large role. That is, that we can have semiotic concepts that allow a large number of representationalism in their theories without us actually knowing to what degree those are. So signs, codes, and information are all concepts that kind of do not lend themselves to this. And this is basically my final point. So no worries, Alin. I'm almost done here. This is literally my second to last slide. If I want to have signs as fully embodied, then I have to come up with the concept of the sign that is itself potentially not representational, unless we allow representationalism to work in there, or if we are allowing our theory to have an interpreter that is perhaps in the brain without it necessarily being representational. It's the same case for codes when we talk about codes, say in code biology, or codes in a more general sense, when putting two worlds of that are not connected together actually happens to turn into meaning. In this sense, when we are faced even with cultural objects that are like abstract, like this is an abstract comic that you can see in the background, in order to keep in line with what I was showing before with comic books. What we have here is a number of illustrations that seem to make sense, not conceptually, but rather as in your perception. And yet, how are we going to process those in a theory of semiotics? Now, I don't have an answer to that specifically, and some of you may think you have actually solved this conundrum. And if you have, then that's awesome. I'm just thinking more about the meta theoretical access that we have to what is embodied in our theories. And I think that's about it in terms of this presentation. As you see, it was a fairly humble rundown of arguments and perhaps about questions. And you have my contact information there if you want to tell me how wrong I am about raising this point. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I think that you're raising a very important question, and I like very much the central reference here. We're open to questions. Questions to Claudio, anyone?
Maybe it was too clear. Oh, I see one.
You spoke, yes, Thiago, please.
Yeah, thank you, Claudio, for your presentation. And I agree with Alin. There are some important points to be addressed. And this matter of disembodiment, embodiment, medium, it's kind of, I kind of have the feeling that it's coming back. And it so there are many important questions that are present in the actuality. For example, the relation between pragmatism and scientific inquiry, with now the presence of different agents within sciences. For example, artificial intelligence, self-moving materials, smart structures, with pose, for example, a new level of embodiment and cognition within scientific inquiry. For example, how do we proceed with this new level of cognition that is also sort of embodied somehow within the inquiry? So this is just to present one of the main aspects, or one of the major aspects of the questions about embodiment or disembodiment and cognition. But perhaps what I would like to address to you right now would be, for example, in terms of Peirce, which is with I am more acquainted with, maybe the suggestion should consider, for example, that semiosis for Peirce, the thirdness in the sense of mediation, embodiment, thought, growth, and especially growth. We are not separate from all those things. According to him, we are in thought, and we are in the flow of semiosis, flow of perceptions, and we are grasping here and there important aspects. We are perceiving what we are ready to interpret, not everything, and we are dealing with that. And within semiotics from Peirce, we have also the concept of symbol, which is not only the repetition of the law, it means also growth, in the sense that implied to the final interpretant, we have the idea of change of. That means it's something that we embody from the sign to the world. It becomes phenomena, again, open to everyone to see. So perhaps if you address this the subject also with this idea of semiosis in mind as a process in which doesn't take place in our minds, but we are part of this whole mind, so to speak. Better stated, this whole bunch of bundle of relations taking place all around us, within us, outside us. This could be also maybe one tool to escape, for example, this difficult separation between embodiment, disembodiment, outside, inside, all those things. This would be my comment. But thank you for the question, for stating the questions.
Thank you, Tiago. I don't know if I have time to address this, but I think generally speaking, your first point was that there's a pullback, I think, in terms of non-embodied cognition or representationalism pushing back into a more mainstream view, because it seems that lately, for the past 15 years or so, embodied cognition has been pretty much en vogue, and that means that there's always going to be a resistance to it. There's always going to be a new development about it. And I feel like if semioticians think that embodiment is actually the path forward, they need to be careful addressing the conceptual issues that may not be fully present when we're trying to make theories of semiotics that are fully embodied. That's why I think being aware of what a question of representationalists may raise is fairly relevant. As for Peirce's solutions, the thing is, you can also conceptualize Peirce as a representational theory of mind, and it always gets a bit confusing about which Peirce you may want to use in your theory. And I feel that when using Peirce, we have to be very careful and have very delicate usage of concepts, because, for instance, if we're going to go heavily on the cynicism, we may have mental properties in multiple objects that we're not going to be able to address properly in terms of a gradient, perhaps. So, of course, I think that you can do a very good job at putting thought into the world and embody it with Peirce, but you can also do a very good job of building a representationalist a theory of mine with pairs as well. So it's always a very interesting push and pull, I guess.
Yeah, just one point, reconnecting to your reply. Yeah, you're right. Depends what you want with that. Then again, we come back to one of your questions. Which tools we need for which task? I mean, I don't mean to pull the whole package of Peirce's philosophy or semiotics inside of one. I mean, hammering. I mean, over a subject. I mean, what do you need to better study your object of research? Then this would be a more open collocation of my suggestion. Of course, we can reinterpret the theory of science through many other aspects. We know that they are extant, but then again, I think more connected to your more general question would be also the suggestion, which uses of signs and which uses of cognition we need in order to let me rephrase this. What is the problem we are dealing with, and which tools we can use to address to these problems in a more clarifying way, not hammering a certain theory of science or perception or phenomenology, but letting first the object of inquiry to speak for itself and see how we can deal with that. I believe that science is also a matter of dialogue, and I think this would be also a matter to consider. But yeah, those are very interesting questions that you posed, especially the one about the medium and embodiment.
Thank you.
I would like to interfere, please. We're running out of time. I think, Claudio, it would be, interesting if you can have a reaction on Amelia Lewis's comment. I think a very interesting comment that she wrote on the chat, after which I think we can call it.
Right, I just saw the message too, and I do agree with Amelia. It's very interesting, especially when you have firsthand experience with animals about what their modes of perception are and their conceptual apparatus, if we can call it that way. So I do agree with you, Amelia, that having a deeper knowledge of pseudosemiotics is very relevant and very important if we're trying to study embodied cognition. Now, it seems fairly common that when we talk about embodied cognitive science, we are stuck with the problem of language in particular. But it seems also when you have a cat at home, you know that the cat is not running multiple mathematical operations when it's just trying to catch a paper ball. So I think there are also more and more ways in which the existence of modes of perception will say something about how the cognitive processes of a certain organism will be developed within our theory. So I think I just agree in general with what you're saying. So thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Claudio. I'll
Thank you.
use my position to say that I think that I'll very shortly write you an email suggesting that we write a paper together. I think that's overdue. Hope you agree. We'll see. Well, thanks very much, Claudio, and thanks for to all speakers for this session.
Ačiū labai visiems.